thank you for coming. We are very pleased to host Mark Nieuwenhuijsen from Barcelona. Some of you may be surprised, but Mark holds a BSc and MSc from Environmental Sciences in the Agriculture Engineering in Wageningen. But he specialized there in occupational hygiene and epidemiology. And then it is from 89. And then in 93, he got a PhD in occupational hygiene epidemiology in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Medicine.
You give away how old I am.
No, you started very early. In the National Health and Lung Institute, University of London. And then he did a postdoc in the Department of Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine in the University of California in Davis. I know that some people are interested in Davis.
I was a medical student.
There you go.
And then from 1960, for about 10 years, he held a position in the Imperial College in various departments, but basically did health risk assessment and management policy. And then from 2007, he is a research professor in the Center of Research and Environmental Epidemiology, CREAL, in Barcelona. So we are very pleased to have you with us, Mark, and the topic is on the board.
Excellent, many thanks, Dad. I'm so glad to be here. I mean, it's wonderful. I've been touring the country a little bit and I had a great time so far. There's still a couple of days to go, so I'm very much enjoying myself. Now, you probably wonder what CREAL actually is, so I thought I'd give you quickly a brief explanation what we are and who we are. So it's here, you can see my office. It's here, there, beside you know, and then we meet together with the students and take it easy. And sometimes when I have time, I go inside here. This is where the building, they have some desk for me, but I try to avoid as much being there. So this is the Biomedical Science Park, Research Park in Barcelona. There are 7 centers there, and one of us is us. We're here at the bottom floor with the least important ones, you know, the genetics part or whatever, it's all on top. The more important you are, the higher up, so we're close at the bottom. But it's a very nice place to work. The institute is fairly new. It's created in 2005, but it came out of an existing institute that has been running since the early 90s. On research, particularly respiratory disease. The institute is sponsored by 3 organizations: the Catalan government, the other research institute, the IMA, and the university. They provide some core funding for the institute, and the rest we have to find our funding ourselves. So the mission is to conduct high quality environmental epidemiological research. And, you know, it will be achieved through competitive research funding. So we're out and about there, always trying to look for funding, as we all do. Of course, we do a bit of education. We have we're contributing to an MPH program that's run by the university and what we're working on. And of course, very much we collaborate with other people around Europe and around the rest of the world. My director is Joseph Maria Ento, and there are a couple of co-directors, and then we have 10 other senior investigators, Elizabeth and myself, who are professors, and the rest associate and associate professors that are out there at the institute. Altogether we have about 100 people, and of them at the moment we have 16 postdocs. We have also 1 postdoc here from Israel. We have ESF, Environmental Health funds postdocs to come to our institution, so if there's any interest, welcome to come. We have 21 PhD students, quite a large number of statisticians to support, and then a number of also research assistant project managers. And also we have a sabbatical program. At the moment we have 4 people that are on sabbatical for 6 months or a year at the institution. We have an external advisory board that's led by Jonathan Sammet from LA. Now our research is divided into 6 programs. We have the cancer program, child health, respiratory health. Myself, I'm leading the air pollution program, water program, radiation program. And under them you see some of the projects that are being carried out. Quite a number of them are European projects. We get quite a bit of funding from Brussels for the competitive tenders for the European Union projects. And I'll be talking about a number of the projects here that we have within the air pollution program. This is not very good. So what I said, we're involved in a Masters of Public Health, where we do some teaching, and we also, the PhD students are registered at the university, Faba University, and so they need to take the Masters before they can do the PhD, in case they don't have a Masters yet. We have some undergraduate teaching as well, and some of our staff teach at other international courses. So that gives you a little bit of idea about what is CREAL. So now more what I would like to talk about, and what I've picked today to talk about is air pollution in Barcelona. And more of that focusing on the exposure assessment of air pollution in Barcelona, more from an epidemiological perspective. My research is mainly looking at the relationship between exposure to air pollution and health effects. Because of the interest here in the group, I focus more on the exposure assessment at the moment. Tomorrow, if you're interested, come to Tel Aviv. I'll talk about the health effects, some of them at least. But today I'm talking about it. So what I talk about is from a perspective of doing epidemiological studies. I mean, and you know, when we do epidemiological studies, often we don't have that much money to do the exposure assessment. Traditionally, what happened is we used routine monitoring data from routine monitoring stations to assign some measure of exposure to subjects in studies. You know, because it's cheap in a way to do, and data's out there, that makes it a bit easier. And also what we focused on often is trying to estimate exposure at where people live, their residents. So say this is their house, let's estimate there what their exposure is. And of course what we know is people move around. So we've been thinking about a little bit, you know, for what can you do? How can you improve the estimation of exposure in a kind of cheaper way? And also how important is that people move around through the environment? So I'm going to give you some results of some recent studies that we've been working on, and some of them are fairly new. It's only last week I got the results, so I haven't really thought about it too much yet. So, but hopefully you can give me some ideas as well. So first of all, in Barcelona, 50% of the cars are diesel cars. It's kind of important, produce quite a bit of particulate matter. We have a very high density of cars. I mean, 4 times higher than in London. We have kind of as a reference, and so you know, it's a very dense city. Having said that, over the years, some of the exposures have been going down. These are some simple measures, estimates from air pollution from the routine monitoring stations. We have different monitoring stations in Barcelona. They're not always placed at the best place, to be honest, but I just put all the data together, give you some trends. So here you see PM10, where the trend is going down a little bit. What we see here for NO2, it went up a little bit, and now there's a trend that's going down again. Probably in the last few years, particularly through this crisis, we got less traffic on the road. We'll change a little bit what's going on. And what we saw, a dramatic decrease actually for NO, nitrogen oxide, probably because of the changes in technology in the cars, what's happening that we don't see in NO2. And then also when you look at black smoke, most of the decrease has been in the early years, what seems to be from here, although maybe that also because the measurements were slightly different, so they're not always directly comparable. And then here you see a down going trend actually developing. Now, one of the first projects that I would like to present, what we've been looking at, what we wanted to do is this because the air quality guidelines in Europe are coming up for review, and so the European community wanted to have a better evidence base to make a decision for how low to set the standard. And so there was a call for proposals for this a few years ago, and as part of a consortium, we're part of a consortium to bid for this, where we wanted to do epidemiological studies for different outcomes in different countries in Europe. And for this it required that the exposure assessment would be the cutting edge exposure assessment using the latest or the best way of assessing exposure, but also the cheapest way. Often for this kind of things you don't have that much money, so you need to come up with some method of coming up with exposure assessment that's cheaper. As what I said before, they use the monitoring stations in a city kind of as an indicator, but we wanted to look at within city variability, because there's quite a bit of within city variability in exposure, because a lot of the air pollution comes from traffic. So major roads determine if you're near a major road you have high levels, but a little bit further away you can have fairly low levels. So there's quite a bit of variability. If you would use one monitoring station or a few monitoring stations within the city, that would get lost in your analysis. So that's what we wanted to look for. So the study was carried out in, or is being carried out, it's not finished yet, in 20 countries. We had 40 different study areas. And the main thing was use of existing health databases or cohorts and build an exposure assessment that was similar in all the different cities, and look then at the exposure response relationship. The whole work is coordinated by Bert Brunekreeft and his team at Utrecht University. And for this kind of European projects is divided up into different work packages. So the first one, kind of the main one, is the exposure assessment, doing exposure modeling. Then we're looking at by outcomes. So we have one work package where I'm a bit more involved in myself, is on pregnancy outcomes. And then there's one on respiratory health, cardiovascular health, and mortality and cancer. So for each there are a number of different cohorts where there is data from. One of them, or some of them that are more involved in, is the EMA cohort, was a birth cohort in Spain, 2,500 births. A BIP cohort in Bradford was 12,000 births, and then the REA cohort in Greece with about 1,700 births. So the idea is to assign exposures to this, or come up with an exposure assessment, and then that you can do the exposure response analysis, to say it in an easy way. So the methodology we chose for this was to develop land use regression models. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with them, so I'll quickly go a little bit through them, what it means a bit later. But this is perhaps not the best method of coming up with an exposure assessment, but a kind of a cost-effective way of coming up with exposure estimates for a population. So you define a certain area. What you need to do is define an area, take some measurements in the area, relate the measurements to some GIS variables that you may have, geographical information system on land use, like road network, population density, and all the kind of other things you may think that influence the concentrations you measure. Where you build a regression equation that you then can use to predict levels in other areas, so build a nice map of it, and then you apply these estimates to people in the population and do then the epidemiological analysis. So as what I said, we had 40 different regions. Now from all the regions, for all the regions, we measured NOx. That's done by passive samplers because it's fairly cheap and easy to do. but there was only funding for 20 regions to measure particulate matter because it's a much more difficult method to do and much more expensive. Here you see the monitor have an impact for particulate matter. For each region we did 3 2-week measurements over 1 year, taking into account the different seasons. For the NOx, it's easier. You use the Ogawa tubes, Ogawa samplers to measure NO2 and NO. Fairly cheap way of doing it. Relatively cheap way of doing it. Easy to be placed. Only have to be a bit careful that they don't get stolen. That's what we found. So, what were the results? If you look at the results from all the sites, initial results. The paper has just been sent away for submission. Here we look at PM10. And let's focus where we see where Barcelona is. What you can see here, the average is in the middle for the lines. And we see that Barcelona is at some of the highest levels measured within Europe. You know, some of the other South European cities also seem to have fairly high PM10 levels. If you look at particularly the coarse fraction, what's PM10 minus PM2.5, you see it even clearer. Here, Barcelona, again, fairly high levels compared to the other cities. Again, the south of Europe, and probably to a large extent this is a result of resuspension of dust, where in the north it rains away, in the south it's too dry, you get quite a bit of resuspension, what creates the higher levels there. If you look at PM2.5, again we see a whole range of the north, it's often lower levels. Here Barcelona, somewhere in the middle, what you get. But then if you look at absorbance, we looked at absorbance of the filter, what's kind of a measure of blackness, what indicates black carbon in the environment. We see that Barcelona has fairly high levels compared to quite a lot of the areas. I mean, mostly in the south, we see the higher levels there. This is where we look by site. This is background, regional backgrounds, urban backgrounds, and street side measurements. And I'm sorry, it's actually too difficult to see, but generally what we see here, we got Barcelona, is that, you know, regional backgrounds are fairly low levels, urban background goes a bit higher, and the street levels are quite high. So it's the kind of relationship what you would expect, that the highest levels are near the streets. Here we look at NO2 and NOx. Oh no, NO2 is the zoning. What we can see here, if we can find Barcelona, we can find Barcelona easily because it's the highest level. Here the street side levels, we actually measure the highest levels in Barcelona for all the different studies. When you look at the correlation, and I've taken here for Catalonia, not only Barcelona, generally you see a fairly good correlation between the different pollutants, except for the coarse fraction, which seems to be slightly lower, where you don't have a good correlation with some of the others, not a good indication. So the kind of message is that we have fairly high exposures in Barcelona compared to the rest of Europe. What in a way may be better for doing epidemiological studies or not. I mean, it depends a little bit still.
This is a correlation in time?
No, it's just by measurement, by monitoring stations, so the different 40 measurement sites and then the correlation between the two. So then, you know, Lange's regression model, what do? The idea is to take the measurements what I just showed you, and then see what are the variables around it, like road network, population density, and other things that may predict your levels. And so that was the next. So we had a whole range of different possible predictors, about 90 of them altogether, that were done in all the different centers. Also looking at the same different buffer sizes, trying to come up with estimates. Now some of it depends a little bit for how good is your GIS data, how good is the description of your data what you have. I mean, most or often what you use is the current data set, but you know, that doesn't give that much information often. And so if there are some local data sets with a much better description of land use, maybe providing you actually better predictors. So that's what we're looking at. And this is a typical one. Barcelona is quite well defined actually, but then if you went to the rest of Catalonia, it was a bit more difficult. So here all the predictive variables, and what you do is you use a linear regression model to predict the concentration. So what we found, these are the models, don't try to read them, but for all the different pollutants we produced regression models that you can then use to predict the levels in places where you haven't done the measurements. And then you can produce a nice little map. And actually this is one of the maps that we produced, and what you can see is that there's quite, this is Barcelona, this is here the coast actually, here we've got the mountains. What you can see, there's a whole range of NO2 levels within Barcelona, but you know what you also can see that to a large extent is actually determined by the road network. For those of you familiar with Barcelona, I mean, these are the rondas, Ronda Litoral, Ronda del Dalt, big roads around, and you got here Diagonal going around, here a busy road, and that's actually where the cars are, is where the highest pollutants are. We did a similar exercise using an air dispersion model. What you see a bit later, you see almost the same pattern. That, keep this picture in your mind, and then later on, I'm sorry you don't have them together, but so and a number of studies, and actually it gives a fairly good prediction, but it's kind of, we don't have that much industry anymore, so you don't see it anymore. Of course, this kind of exercise, actually a lot of people involved, you know, and it's not me doing it, it's all the other people that are doing an awful lot of work, and just want to you to be aware of it. Now, when you predict exposure, you know, when you use this kind of model, you're trying to predict people's exposure at the residences. But is this actually exposure that, you know, people get? I mean, people don't sit at their home all the time, so they're moving around. So now we're going a bit more into the personal assessment of exposure. And what we did here, we had a group of about 50 pregnant women that we gave a PM monitor and an NOx monitor to carry with them. So they had a little backpack. I'll get a photo here. So he had a backpack with cyclone in it to measure PM2.5, and then they also had the Ogawa sampler here. The PM2.5 only could wear for 2 days, because otherwise it's a bit too much, filter gets full. And the Ogawa, they were wearing it for a week. At the same time, they were writing down where they went and what they did, and to give us some idea for what's going on. Our interest mainly is to see to what extent is there a relationship between the outdoor measurements and the personal measurements. Outdoor measurements of the home, we put it just outside the home, or the indoor measurements and the personal measurements. So 54 women actually, they carried it out for a year. We actually just finished analyzing the data. It takes always quite a long time. You get this, it's a large data set. And they had different visits where we picked up different information. So here are some of the results, the concentrations for what we see. If you look at PM2.5, what you can see, you know, it's not the first study what's showing it. You can see that the average levels of personal exposure are higher than the indoor levels or the outdoor levels. There's a kind of typical thing what you tend to see. We see the same for absorbance. Personal levels are higher than indoor and outdoor levels. Less so what you see for NO2 or NOx. And then one of the things what we're interested in is to what extent is there a correlation. What we see is most of the time is that the personal levels are best correlated with the indoor levels here for PM2.5, for absorbance, for NO2, for NOx, where you can see the best. And unfortunately, there's less so a correlation between outdoor levels. The best what we actually got was for NO2, where we had in this case is Spearman correlation. Ideally, you would have more of that because we're trying to predict the exposure outdoor people's home, that there would be a better correlation with personal exposure, but it's not the case in this thing. And these are some correlations between different pollutants. Generally, there's some correlation between some of the pollutants, but not for others. So also we had information on the time activity patterns, and that's what we've seen in other studies as well, is that people spend a lot of their time indoors, 60% home indoors. That probably explains the good correlation between indoor pollution and personal exposure. And then also spend some time at work. A number of the women didn't work anymore, so there's less. But then also tend to spend some time in transportation, trying to get from one place to the other. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the exposures a bit later, but keep that in mind. Furthermore, we asked them to keep sheet for what they were doing and what kind of the housing characteristics, trying to explain the measurements we made. So to see, for example, for smoking, what you would expect increases the concentration of the exposure a little bit by 20% for people that were in a smoky area. Most of the time it didn't work that well, because I think we had only too limited number of women to do the regression analysis, and when people write it down, they don't always write it down well enough to actually being used in the regression analysis. So it was limited, the information what we got out of this on the predictors of the exposure, what we saw. Now another thing what we did was, one of my colleagues, Carol, he analyzed the elemental analysis of the PM and used this to look at source apportionments. Where does the PM exposure come from? And here is what you can see. I must say, to a large extent, he couldn't explain where things came from. The largest part is actually what's kept unexplained. But it was interesting to see that he could describe what some other parts for where things came from. Where you can see here. And for the part that he could describe, about, we could say that about half the PM2.5, the personal, comes from traffic-related sources. Now another one, what I thought was interesting, and we talked about it quite a bit because we couldn't explain it, is this small percentage, but still considerable, 2%, comes from cosmetics. So we were able to pick up women applying cosmetics, and that's kind of remarkable. I never realized that you could do it with this. There were certain signatures there for what we saw that pointed to cosmetics. We've written a paper on that. I won't go into it any further. Again, I mean, there are quite a lot of people involved actually doing this study and what's going on. So as what I said, one of the things what actually, women spend some time traveling, and what we think for, if you're in the kind of traveling microenvironment, you may get higher exposure. And that's one study we set up to see, what are the exposure levels while people are traveling using different modes. For this was more kind of, we set up a study where we had two different routes that people were taking. One was from the Sagrada Familia. Any of you been in Barcelona, seen the Sagrada Familia? Yeah, probably well familiar with it. So they were traveling from there to our institute, what's here on the beach. And the other one was from Pobla Sec. Some of you have been to the IC conference, was up here. So they were traveling around here. So we had them traveling, we had them walking, we had them cycling, taking the car, taking the bus, these different routes, and then we did a number of measurements. Now we had a whole range of different measurements we were taking. Just, when you do this kind of studies, you're interested in everything, so give me something. So what we see here is the microephelometer to measure black carbon. Black carbon, a good indicator for diesel. This is PM2.5 sampler. The thing is, because the journeys are fairly short, you need to have a sampler with a high volume to get enough PM2.5 on there. These are for ultrafines, the P-tracks and CPC. Dust track for a continuous PM2.5. And then there's something, I don't know what it is. And as you can see, it's quite difficult to put everything on people's back or put them in the... this is the microephelometer. I love this thing. The problem is it's so bloody expensive. I mean, you measure exactly what you want to have, but I mean, 8,000 euros for this thing. Oh yeah. So you couldn't put it on the back. So what we did for those walking or taking the bus or whatever, we had this little what's it called? Shopping bag to put all the instruments on. And then here we put it on the bike. This is Scott Froon from LA who helped us. And you know Scott, you're looking so happy there. We had Scott Froon and Dane Westerveld came to help us with this as well. And this is the fist, the Gary fist. It's at the back of our building. This is Nadine, by the way, my PhD student was involved in that. She's not doing the PhD on there, but she's happy to demonstrate microenvironmental again, because we love it so much then. And so actually what we found, here are some of the levels. I'll just go straight to the results, is what you see actually. The walking generally had the lowest level, and the bus with the car much higher, what you would expect. Also here for CO and for black carbon, you know, what gets closer to the road in the middle got actually higher levels. Now I just realized I forgot the next slide, because actually when you take into an inhalation rate for the cyclists, they inhale more, so the inhaled dose is a bit higher, but I'll make the point that a little bit later. So what it is, so we got data, and also we just finished the paper and it's been submitted for what's going on. Also the levels what you actually see here are a bit higher than the ambient monitoring station, so in this microenvironment there's actually higher levels. Then also because you know you get like from the microenvironmeter you get continuous data, so you can see when people are traveling what is actually the levels, and this and also from the CPC. But this is a plot for the black carbon from the microenvironmeter. We gave people a GPS so that we can track them exactly where they are, and you can see the person going here, and the darker the dots, the higher the levels of black carbon. Here, for example, this is Columbus, the big statue that's there on the end of the Ramblas. Lots of cars stopping here or pulling up, so you get higher levels, and then you go further down, you go to the harbor, and you see the levels going down. You get to our institute, levels are pretty low. Now, one of the other things what you can see here, this is, I think it's a person walking. The other thing what you can see here, for example, in this street, it seems to be that the person is going up and down, a bit drunk going from one side of the road to the other, but it's not really drunk, but it's the GPS with the signal that, because you're in high buildings, so you get a bit of a bouncing of the signal, what causes this variability in this. So, and that's one of the problems what we have in Barcelona with the GPS signal because of the high buildings. But you know, this is what we're doing further, is trying to determine why some of the levels are higher. So we're looking at if this are near traffic lights, what's happening. So we have a whole bunch of data that we actually can analyze that. Again, there's a number of people, in particular, as what I said, to point out that Scott Froon and Dane Westerveld came over to help us and spend a few weeks in Barcelona. And they keep coming back. I don't know why. He says that we need to do more work. I mean, that's... I said, no. And then the last project, what I want to show, because you know it's still not that easy to do, so together with our collaborators in Berkeley, Mike Jarrett and Seaton, we've been looking at using the smartphone to track people and also get information on their physical activity. To track them through the environment. Here is Golfit is a software that you can download on any Android phone. This one, it's not the phone we're using, I don't know which one this is. We're keeps changing what we're using at the moment. Anyway, it just uses the GPS positioning thing from the phone, where people are. And also, if you keep your phone up and down, there's a motion sensor in there that you always get your screen right. And this motion sensor you can use also to look at physical activity. Because if you jump up and down, that thing goes also up and down. So you can use that information. Now, you know, there's different ways of measuring this exposure, what to do with it, what you could do, what you could think of, you know, having this smartphone going together with some personal sensor like the microenvironmeter, or this is the sensoris, so that you know where people are in the environment, or you know how much physical activity they have, what the exposure levels are, so you can estimate the inhaled dose for it. Now, as what I said, the problem is these things are so expensive. I mean, 8,000 euros. I mean, that's they're a bit big, so it's not that easy yet. We're still waiting for a small sensor that we can have. You know, a small one that keeps working, no problem, whatever. But it's not there at the moment. So one of the things that. The other thing is what you could do. You know, is put sensors around the city. Here in Israel, you have airbase. There's the airbase sampler. Put them around the city, do some land use regression modeling or whatever, then track with the smartphones where people are, and also look at the physical activity, how much they inhale. Put some ad hoc studies looking at, you know, if they use certain modes of transport, if they're in the car, a bit higher exposure than if they're cycling, that kind of things, or indoor-outdoor ratios from the home. And apply that, and then you can use some inhaled dose. That unfortunately, you know, we don't have this kind of sensors yet. We don't have enough money to buy them, to put them around the city. Also, you could, you know, do some validation with some sampler. So the method, what we actually chosen to look at is to get some further idea of people's exposure in different times, is to use this land use regression map. Actually used an air dispersion map. I don't know why I left it here. We used an air dispersion map, but it's more or less the same, with some temporal trend from continuous monitoring stations to make it vary from day to day, because you know the spatial map gives you only the spatial map for the spatial distribution of the pollutants for a certain time period, but with the temporal, with the monitoring data, you can put a temporal trend on there. Then give them the smartphones to track them and look at their physical activity. Use some ad hoc studies looking at indoor-outdoor ratios and different commuters to calculate inhaled dose, because that's what we're interested in. So, and this is what you see. We had 30 volunteers. We gave them the phone for a week and then had them just run around. And actually, what we were hoping was that they would stay, particularly in Barcelona, because we have more data on that. But of course, you know, they don't never do what you want them to do. They just go all out and about, and some of them go swimming. No, this is just the problem with the GPS signal. In some cases, it ends up in the sea. So one of the problems with this is that, you know, the signals what you get are, you need to clean them, and this one is an unclean data set what they go around. So. But so to get a better idea of their inhaled dose, we focus on Barcelona, so in the middle, but you have to realize that sometimes they go somewhere else. So here some of the data is the data for the 30 volunteers, and that we map now. This is after cleaning some of the data. And also the darker dots, the physical activity is higher. With the light dots, the physical activity is less. So one of the things what you can see is, you know, when people go here, the physical activity is low in a way, because they're probably sitting in a car and they're not doing very much, they're just driving around the Ronda. This is Barcelona, by the way, so this is here, this is the harbour, this is the park. This is the city centre. It seems to be if they get to the city centre, they have more physical activity. Probably they're walking around, cycling or whatever. Quite interesting to see. This is for all the 30 subjects together, for all of them. So we get some sense, and I didn't have a picture for one volunteer that you could follow. That's why I end up. Then as what I said, we used an air dispersion map of Barcelona. For this time we had a regional agency that actually had some air dispersion data. We preferred to use this rather than the land use regression model for this exercise. Again, what you can see, this is for NO2, and it follows exactly the roads. It's a bit stretched out compared to the other one, but you can see that it's more or less the same pattern what you get as from the land use regression models that I showed you before. Again, you get diagonal, rondas, Gran Via going round, and then, you know, the further away you get from roads, the lower the levels actually get. So, now this is a bit small, I'm sorry, because I said we're just analyzing the data and it's not that clear. So what we have here is data from the 30 volunteers and the time spent in different microenvironments. So how much time they spent at home, how much time they spent at work, how much time at travel, and in other areas. What we see that is on average they spend 50% of their time at home, 33% time at work, and 6% of the time traveling.
Reported or measured?
Measured. This is from the GPS data, so we can see we use this. Actually, one thing more, we only pick 1 day out of the 7 days for each volunteer to do this. So this is using the GPS data exactly to know where they are. So this is the advantage of this. And 30% were at other times. Here you see the mean energy intensity expressed in METs, so this is using the sensor. What you can see is that when they're at home, the METs is almost 1. You know, 1 METs is no physical activity. When they're at work, it's 1.52, a bit more physical activity at work. And when they're traveling, as you may expect, it's 3.3, higher. You know, this is a mix of different traveling modes. Some of them are by car, but quite a few of them are cycling or walking or taking public transport. And so that we get some idea for this then. Now, these are the concentrations, and the first one is the concentration. I mean, first of all, you can see quite a bit of variability also for the other one where people spend. But these are the concentration if you just take into account that people are at home, at work, and in transit, traveling. And if you would take the concentrations of the map, if you just say, you know, have the map, and then say, for people are here, what is the concentration when they're there? And what you can see in this one, that the concentration at home would be 54, while traveling 56, and here 53. This is without applying any temporal trend or mode transfer or whatever that. Because actually when you apply that, the picture becomes quite different, because then what you have for 54 at home stays 54 when applying it, but for example, if you go in transit, traveling, actually the exposure goes up much higher because people are much closer to the road and get the higher exposure. And then in particular, when you take this into account, the inhalation, where you take into account physical activity and how much people inhale, is what you see. If you look at the percentages here, is that on average 40% of the exposure of the inhaled dose comes when people are at home, 24% is when they're traveling, and 28% is when they're at work. So even though they only spend 7% of the time traveling, they get 24% of their inhaled dose, you know, while they're traveling. Also, you see, you know, only 40% of their inhaled dose during that day they actually get at home, while we're using the home place as an indicator for our epidemiological studies. Now, you know, we're still working on this data. As I said, it's only last week that we got it all together, and so some things may slightly change, but I think this gives you some idea of what the patterns are going to be, what could be, and what we're doing. Again, we're doing it with a number of people. I mean, particularly important collaborator Ethan Seaton, who is writing the code for the CALFIT, and also Mike Jarrett, with whom we're working on this. We've got another study now, or 2 other studies, where we're going to use this method, one with 200 volunteers as part of an active transportation study, and another 100 volunteers as part of a study on green space and health. So that's why I'm coming to the end. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of an idea of what we do for modeling, how we use kind of, you know, relatively easy and cheap methods to measure spatial distribution, but then also that we do further work on personal exposure to get a better idea for what's going on, and if the measurements that we do or the models that we do give you a good indication of personal exposure. Of course, I mean, I have to warn you that, you know, this is one example for one city. From Barcelona, we do it in different cities, so results may be different in different cities, depending on city design and all kind of things. And we're doing some further studies on this to find this out. So thank you very much for your attention. Not on the chair, because I mean, you mean looking at the effects on birth weight or so. Not for the 60, because it's too small to do anything. But the 60 were recruited from a clinic that routinely collects data on pregnant women. And we use that database to relate to air pollution. So we have a database that 4,000 pregnant women each year. And so we have data for 4 years, 16,000 women for that, where we use this exposure assessment for escape from to relate to the pregnancy outcomes. But this was more because it's a very small data set to look at how well we're doing there.
I mean, you are talking about exposure to air, since we are exposed also to drinking water. So is there a way to, I mean, you look at the outcome and you don't know which exposure it was. Is it possible to integrate it in some way?
I mean, that's what we're hoping to do. I'm not sure we can do it here for us. But we're trying to do it. I mentioned to you the Bradford study, the Bradford cohort, what's a birth cohort of 12,000. There actually we do also land use regression models for NOx in this particular region, but also we have taken water samples where we mainly look at disinfection byproducts in the water. So there we want to do a joint analysis of the DBPs and the air pollutants. But many places they don't have the information at the same time. One of the things for the water contaminants is that you need to have some indication of how much women are drinking, and they're not always collected. So you need to have some idea what is the water level, the water consumption, yeah. And so we have it for the VIP cohort, and there are a few other cohorts in Europe that have the same information, but not many of them. So we're hoping to do that. In Barcelona it's a bit more difficult because there's a lot of mix of water, and actually it's the north of Barcelona have low levels, the south have high levels, in the middle it's a mix. And the women that we have in our study are mainly from the south, so there's not much variability, and we don't have any data on consumption of water, so it's not very good in this kind of sample size. I've done it before in other studies, but much larger sample sizes, so you can ignore it.
I'm curious about the slide you showed on the source proportion of the PM that you collected from the filters. You know, I understand just basically that different sources have different fingerprints and profiles. How were you able to distinguish the cosmetics, and were there specific cosmetics that provided the PMs? Like, I don't even think the cosmetics did not particularly.
Yeah.
You never use
the powder, yeah, it's a powder thing. There are 3 of them. Yeah, it's, I don't know.
I imagine each type of cosmetic would have a different profile. Like,
no, they use a base, I think it's titanium, what's there as a marker, what you see coming up, with 2 others, and I can't remember so quickly which are the 2 others. But they're very clearly.
Zinc oxide, titanium dioxide.
Could be, yeah. They're very, very clear ones, what you see actually coming up. And we saw these peaks and we're wondering, where did it come from? What is this? And then actually going back to the literature, it became clear these are the cosmetic ones that they're close to
the flex.
Yeah.
How about the metro system? Is it did you check it?
I didn't do, but Safi Carroll that I'm working with, he just recently did some measurements. The levels are not too high actually.
It's a new system, right?
It's a new system, yeah, and they have air conditioning. What keeps the levels relatively low, I think for PM2.5, I think he measured something like 25 micrograms per meter cube, while the average in Barcelona is 18. And NOx will be reduced. So it's actually relatively low. I mean, I've done measurements in other metro systems, like in London, where we measure 300 micrograms per meter cube. That's much higher, but it's actually in Barcelona, it's relatively low, particularly for the modern lines. I think he was saying there was one line that was a bit more dirty, but I haven't seen the data. I just spoke to him about it.